The Vienna Woods, highly praised and well-loved. This scenic jewel, this green lung, narrowly avoided destruction 150 years ago.
That plan was actually to first cut down the Vienna woods and then to sell the land.
In the late 19th century, the empire stood at the brink of transition from a monarchy to a state administration. Administrative authorities were being crushed between old and new ideals.
Officials were being accused of corruption.
Private entrepreneurs and prudent thinkers became the knights of an invaluable asset.
It can also be said that he was the first modern environmentalist in Austria. Schöffel had made a lot of enemies. He was threatened.
Modern civil rights completely rewrote the rules of the game.
He was always a step ahead, right? So he had a very strong insider knowledge.
Around the year 1870, a crime thriller took place at the gates of Vienna that would never have been possible before. And the hero of this story is a retired, low-ranking state official.
And he was Joseph Schöffel, the so-called savior of the Vienna woods.
The Vienna Woods stretch from the Prater green space in Vienna's second district to Lilienfeld in the west and Baden to the south. For a long time, Vienna was not this large, so at first it remained tucked away in a nice shady green space. With the enormous expanse of the city from 1850, the magnificent Lower Austrian forest became of increasing interest to the Viennese, and the conversation quickly turned to money. Should Vienna lose its green belt based on a handshake made by a select few behind closed doors? Here, Joseph Schöffel came into play, the savior of the Vienna woods. In his hometown of Mödling, many places serve to remind us of this gentleman who, as a lone individual, conquered an entire region for the Lower Austria, Vienna for nature conservation. In the early 1870s, he took steps which still influence the quality of life for people living in the area today.
He was a retired first lieutenant in the army. He actually had no political connections and had no plans other than to spend his old age here in Vienna. However, at the time, the Ministry of Finance were planning to destroy the Vienna woods, and in 1870, it came down to a portion of about 10% of the woods with a size of 5,000 hectares, which was to be felled. Schöffel did not want this, because the town of Mödling lies directly on the border of this part of the forest, and so he set out to fight against the devastation of the town's background, as he called it.
A retired lieutenant. Today this sounds like a senior ranking, but Schöffel was actually only 40 years old when he set out his initiative for the Vienna woods. A large part of the army was out of service due to the peaceful period, regardless of their age, so Schöffel had time to spend on his interests. These included natural sciences, literature, writing, and reading newspapers. As a well-informed citizen, he had the terrible suspicion that the first tree fellings close to Mödling were just the first steps of a plan to gradually turn the entire forest into money.
So Schöffel got involved with politics with the Vienna woods, and his political career lasted almost until 1910, so almost over 40 years, where he was mayor of Mödling, a member of the state parliament, and also a member of the Reichs Council. This political career, of course, became something very special and important for him, forming widespread opinions.
How was this previously unknown activist able to have such a big impact? He was outbalanced by the power of his opponents. Ministerial officials and the imperial family were part of old systems entrenched with monopoly and favoritism. Business conduct was impenetrable, serving the economic interests of a city of millions.
Joseph Schöffel was a revolutionary when it came to dealing with the media or appearing as a politician. He came from the middle classes, so wasn't an aristocrat, and so wasn't supported by the imperial family. He started 150 years ago with a conscious effort to use the media to start campaigns in 1870. And he was, so to speak, a one-man NGO in the fight against the deforestation of the Vienna woods. With 2 articles a week in the Viennese newspapers, he tried to explain to the public and to politicians and officials what was really going on with the Vienna woods in terms of deforestation, dissipation of assets, and environmental pollution and destruction.
As the time passed, this one-man NGO found more and more supporters. His persistent newspaper campaign began to show results. Week after week, more and more readers were convinced by Schöffel's arguments, because rather than being satisfied stating his opinions, he created arguments with meticulously presented evidence and calculations. This helped him to win supporters from several sides: residents living in communities close to the Vienna woods, Viennese citizens concerned about the continued existence of their recreational areas, civil servants who consider the machinery to go against the law, and even in-leaders of the imperial family, such as Archduke Albrecht, Duke of Teschen, who was a massive support to the campaign. Many officials risked their jobs to provide inside information to Schöffel's arguments.
Schöffel was insanely clever. He initially published the articles anonymously in the Neues Vienna Tagblatt, which was actually a liberal newspaper, so it was positioned similarly to the campaign. He managed to withstand heavy pressure, including after defamation lawsuits were brought against him again and again, which reminds us a little of the media today, because he had insider knowledge and supporters in bureaucracy, so he was actually able to publish parts of the real contracts in the paper. He also had file notes, conversation notes, and so on, so he was always one step ahead of those trying to stop him. It could be said that it was only made possible to do such a thing in 1870, as in 1876 the Constitution was created, which largely still stands today, and which gave basic rights to the citizens. One of these rights was freedom of the press, so this press campaign against the state wouldn't have been possible before the Constitution was created 3 years earlier.
The Vienna woods already had its lobby in terms of names. The Viennese in the late 19th century were attracted by the trend for summer breaks. Aristocrats went to the countryside to escape the noisy, dusty, and hot city. The destruction of the city wall and the construction of the ring road made life in the magnificent inner-city palaces uncomfortable sometimes. Those who could used the green space laying at the gates of Vienna. However, Schöffel thought that the Vienna woods offered more than just an attractive summer destination.
For example, he distinguished between a commercial forest and a recreational forest. For 150 years previously, he had considered the Vienna woods to be a forest which added value for the city of Vienna in terms of air quality and cooling of the city. He also explained, for example, that the other forests in the area did not have these same values. They were purely commercial forests. It's unbelievable when you read his memoirs to see how modern his way of thinking was.
a way of thinking which wasn't yet anchored in everyone's consciousness at the time. The Habsburgs, for example, primarily associated the Vienna woods with hunting, which is of course a luxury which must be limited in times of crisis. That was the short-sighted perspective of the recreational hunters. After the wars in the middle of the 19th century, the losses were great. They had been very expensive wars. Franz Joseph had enormous debts, and he thought it would be a good idea to sell a part of the Vienna woods to a wood dealers, a Mr. Moritz Herschel, who bought a quarter of Vienna woods for deforestation.
The idea behind it was to show the population that the Vienna woods no longer existed and that they could therefore be sold because they no longer held recreational value for the people. Due to the cutbacks at the time and the agreement made, part of the Vienna woods would be completely destroyed, with no value remaining or plans to allow the new forest to grow, with the soil also being exposed to erosion, with the humus blown or washed away by wind and rain. Especially in the northern Vienna woods, the dry and barren sandstone would be exposed, meaning basically no new vegetation would actually be able to grow.
Und vor allem hier im nördlichen Wienerwald, im Flüsch-Sandstein, kommt dann der trockene, der karge Sandstein hervor. Es kommt der Lehm hervor, auf dem eigentlich kein neuer Bewuchs mehr wächst.
In this real-life crime drama, Moritz Herschel can be seen as Josef Schöffel's enemy for his planned destruction of the Vienna woods. As a timber wholesaler, he was well known in the business world of Vienna, a businessman who had taken his chance to seize success and fortune in the rapidly growing economy. For Herschel, the forest section was a business opportunity, not related to his own beliefs or interests. Constantly appearing in the newspapers for months due to the planned deforestation was certainly not pleasant, but it certainly didn't ruin him. There were plenty of other woods and forests which could serve his business needs. Herschel could live quite well without the Vienna woods. There wasn't as much at stake for him compared to Schöffel and his fellow activists. However, the details that Schöffel brought to light about the deal that Herschel and the state representatives made brought about a new issue. From now on, the business world had to prepare themselves for the fact that their operations no longer necessarily remained secret. The press could keep an eye on them, to provide fair transparency, to spark discussions, and to bring projects to a standstill. Schöffel's journalistic talent, his persistence, and his accuracy made him a celebrity.
Schöffel became a celebrity as the savior of the Vienna woods in 1872. When he was nominated to be mayor of the Mödling Council. He never ran for office, but was simply nominated for mayor, and he accepted the election on the condition that he had the freedom to clean up what he described as the Mödling mess. Gave the local council the choice of giving him this freedom to rebuild the school, to renovate the courthouse, to build a hospital, to repair the streets, and to fix the canal. Otherwise, he would refuse to be mayor. The council unanimously accepted these conditions, and with this agreement, Schöffel was given the freedom to bypass the council. As one man, he shook up the system in Mödling completely, and at some point or other, the council had to ask themselves what had happened.
Die Mödlinger Gemeinderäte mussten sich über kurz oder lang die Augen reiben, was innerhalb von 2-3 Jahren hier alles passiert ist.
Mödling is one of the few larger towns which have a strong connection to the Vienna woods. For centuries, the woods were very sparsely populated, with very few paths. It was only possible to travel on horseback or by foot. Before the Habsburgs, the area served as a hunting ground for the Babenbergs.
Although there were, of course, towns that were built specifically at the intersections of important roads, for example, Bergsdorf or Leopoldsdorf,
Some charcoal burners lived and worked in the forest, but as soon as the prospering small settlements had developed, they fell in the repeated raids from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Vienna woods became a forest of ghosts, but the imperial court in Vienna was used to getting wood from its hunting grounds.
This then prompted Maria Theresa to bring in people or experts from other areas, and that's where the names of the villages come from. Like Tirolhof were brought in so that the timber supply could flourish again.
This strategic revitalization was a success and brought more than just wood, because when forests are not left to be wild, intensive work is needed. The first person who actually recognized the great importance of the Vienna woods as a local recreational space, the Green Lung of Vienna, was Maria Theresia, who had already issued forestry regulations in 1785, which ensured that deforestation went more or less hand in hand with replanting, so that the population would be secure long-term. Today, a lot is known about reforestation and forest care, and the Vienna woods have largely become a biosphere park, maintained according to the principles of nature conservation. Wood felling is regulated precisely and highly restricted. But how did the timber industry fit in with the monarchy?
Wood felling was extremely basic. It was all done by hand. There were hardly any machines. It was all very laborious. A special saw was brought in to cut trees, which was double-handed, so one person pulled up and the other downwards. The one pulling downwards had the easier job.
Workhorses helped with the transport through the impassable terrain. The destination, the nearest river which could be used as a waterway. In the areas of the Vienna woods with less water, these were hard to come by.
In some areas, there was not a big wood drift. There were just small hermitages. The biggest hermitage was called Leopoldgraff. This was the last one before the rivers went further up in the mountains, because here, at this point, a lot of rivers came together from the whole drainage basin. So wood was extracted and then taken along the rivers before it was transported to Vienna to be used in construction.
The demand for wood in the monarchy was enormous. At the end of the 19th century, Vienna was a boomtown, with a lively influx of workers from all over the empire, and the industry needed unprecedented amounts of energy. Coal and wood fueled the engines propelling a new, modern way of life.
So wood was, of course, the primary raw material until the late 19th century. For a long time, it was firewood, so you can imagine that in the 1840s, the city had about 400 to 500,000 inhabitants, so they needed 1.6 million cubic meters of firewood each year. If you want to try to imagine how much that would be, imagine a pile of wood about a meter high, and that would then cover the whole city of Vienna almost entirely. So that was a huge amount that was needed, that you could have never gotten from the Vienna woods, meaning, of course, it had to be attained through other means. Lumber workers had a very important role, especially in the expansion of Vienna from the 1850s until the end of the monarchy, where the population grew from 500,000 to more than 2 million, which meant that a lot of house building was taking place. Then there were also huge infrastructural projects, work on the Danube, all the railway construction, the public buildings, the ring road, and so Vienna became a huge construction site for these 50 to 60 years where wood was constantly needed.
Despite its inefficiency when being burned, wood remained the only heating material for hundreds of thousands of households in the capital city. In any case, the Vienna woods were never an area that the whole of Vienna could blindly rely upon for timber. Neither the imperial family under Franz Joseph nor the state officials or wood wholesalers could successfully persuade people that the woods had no purpose beyond their economic value, or that they were like any ordinary forest.
Of course, we valued sustainability early on, and in general, in forestry, it was important. The origins of sustainability as a concept are actually rooted in forestry, because you could realize quite quickly with the forest that you can't take more than what can grow back. Otherwise, it actually causes major damage. Actually, the Vienna woods have been carefully managed for a relatively long time. So from that perspective, they were actually only interspersed with small settlements, but otherwise left relatively untouched as a very naturally preserved landscape.
It must be said that the knowledge of the value of the Vienna woods was there, but it was simply ignored out of business interests. This cold-blooded approach from the Habsburgs can be nicknamed the Grüne Sünde, after the popular cocktail, literally meaning green sin. The nickname doesn't just apply from today's perspective, but also from the knowledge at the time that existed about the biological function of forests, especially because of the Vienna woods' location. However, what the businessmen had not expected was that their deals would be closely inspected, and then all of the misdeeds they were about to do would be explained clearly to the entire public.
He was the senior lieutenant of the army, who was also a very precise man when it came to financial resources, and he brought 2 or 3 major issues to the forefront. Firstly, the deforestation of the Vienna woods, which was completely below the value of the wood. Secondly, the resource-damaging approach of hiring a company to destroy the forest without plans to regrow trees. And thirdly, that the population was not really informed about what the government planned or what the State Council for Finance planned to do with the forest, because the forest belonged to the Finance Ministry at the time and was handled in the same way as real estate or money, only representing a financial value and not a biological or recreational value.
Keinen biologischen Wert oder hatte keinen Erholungswert oder einen Wert für die gute Luft.
To determine the value of the Vienna woods, the minister at the time made a statement saying that 500,000 Gulden would be received in exchange for 5,000 wood deliveries. Joseph Schöffel proved to him that these proceeds were actually half of the actual value, and that the forest was actually worth 1 million Gulden. 1 Gulden is the equivalent to around 14 euros, so the entire Vienna woods would be worth around 140 million euros.
Also im Staatsbesitz befindliche Wienerwald 140 Millionen Euro wert gewesen.
140 million euros. That may have been acceptable for an emergency sale, but it doesn't match up in any way to the true value of the Vienna woods as we would measure it today. A value which cannot be reflected through contracts and balance sheets. A value that does not generate an immediate profit.
Herschel was simply a renowned wood wholesaler to the monarchy, with many connections throughout Austria, so he was one of the active main players in the timber industry. It was relatively obvious that someone such as this would be commissioned for this kind of exploitation. Moritz Herschel, of course, because of this, only offered the lowest prices for the area. On the other hand, the Ministry of Finance, who knew little of this kind of economics, would have started the deforestation of the Vienna woods, saying that they had a flat-rate contract, and Herschel was allowed to do as he pleased. Joseph Schöffel, however, had experts prove that the wood prices shown by Moritz Herschel were only 50% of the actual market price, upending the capitalist Herschel and the official experts from the finance ministry.
As a Jewish man, Herschel found himself under general suspicion in the late 19th century, with growing anti-Semitism painting him as unscrupulous. This aspect perhaps motivated some supporters of Schöffel's initiative.
But otherwise, he was just an entrepreneur who took advantage of the opportunity he received. Schöffel didn't have any personal objections against him. He actually primarily attacked the civil service. That's one of the biggest questions that Schöffel also addressed. How did Herschel get these contracts? Here, Schöffel alleged partial bribery, partial racketeering, or similar things. Because how could someone really have gotten this privilege of having an exclusive monopoly over the Vienna woods? At the time, with this question of how Herschel had been granted this privilege and received the right, economic authorities like to be as quick and efficient as possible and uncomplicated. This could be one reason.
Unkompliziert und verwaltungstechnisch einfach irgendwie diesen Wienerwald, könnte man sagen, jetzt zu nutzen.
Nevertheless, you could say that the comfort factor undoubtedly played a role in these decisions. Pragmatism, a classic virtue of the authorities, and a typical Viennese specialty.
He uncovered these grievances and, in 1872, the contracts were actually cancelled under the authority of Kaiser Franz Joseph, being personally opposed to these contracts.
Good things come to those who wait. Schöffel's persistence and his countless press articles ultimately allowed him to emerge as the victor in this contest. 1-0 for Mödling, and a defeat for the House of Habsburg. As a reward, the immaculately preserved Vienna woods still benefit people in Vienna and Lower Austria to this day, as well as the great world between the roots and the leaves. Opinion on who actually owns the woods depends on how you look at it. Looking solely at purchase contracts, there is a different picture.
The monasteries and the Habsburgs were the main owners of the Vienna woods. A large part was the imperial hunting grounds, which is why it has been so largely isolated from the city. Many people in Vienna likely did not know much about the forest for a long time. It was rather impassable, at least in the inner parts, so the Kaiser was the main owner. Then, later it became state property. And then there are the monasteries, like the Heiligenkreuz, who are landowners. And there are also smaller owners too. The majority actually belong to the imperial house as their hunting grounds, and then to the state.
The economic value of the Vienna woods, as measured by a landowner, always comes down to the potential raw materials. In addition to wood and small amounts of charcoal, the Vienna woods have other mineral resources to offer.
As well as the wood, there are also rocks to be mined, which is especially relevant in the area where we are here. The quartz sandstone is a very important building material for walls, churches, bridges, and so on, as well as for private houses. There were dozens of quarries mining this type of rock, and just east of the woods there is limestone, which was also mined until after the First World War. There were huge quarries, and the votive church in Vienna was built from the rock, as well as other buildings. There is a whole series of ring road buildings along the front of the former lake, where limestone was also mined. There are still clay pits in Hennersdorf for brick production. These were mined for the creation of bricks from the clay, and they stretch across the city.
Clay bricks and limestone, products that today's Viennese people only associate with construction. When they think of the Vienna woods, they only picture idyllic residential areas, mountain biking, jogging, family trips, and inviting forest rest stops. Dreams that are already 150 years old.
He was incredibly current. To think that he was already talking about a welfare forest in 1870 and about the cooling effect and oxygen contents in relation to rest and relaxation areas for Viennese people who could go for a walk or relax here, or simply leave the big city.
The forest has many mythical faces. In fairy tales and stories, it is often the last refuge of lost civilizations or a lawless land and hiding place for dark forces. When did the forest gain its image as a threatening force of nature or inhospitable place?
The Vienna woods were then defined with essential terms, which still have an impact today. In other words, the Vienna woods in today's sense would have remained much the same. On the other hand, the woods serve as a contrasting space, as a counterpoint to the big city, which was rapidly growing and industrializing. It was a sort of good counterpoint to the dirty city, and at the same time, it was a place of imagination where the old past could still be felt. The cozy Vienna and outskirts of the city became a landscape where the forest came to be joined with the big city in harmonious unity. An example is the current landscape of the woods at the edge of Vienna.
Ein Beispiel, zum Beispiel die heurigen Landschaft am Rande von
Wien. Vienna was more than well advised to preserve its green belt.
I read a suggestion in an agricultural paper from the time, which said that if the state were to sell the woods, it would be an opportunity for the city of Vienna to acquire the land. Instead of investing the money in a neo-Gothic town hall, whose construction had just been approved by Kaiser Franz Joseph in the summer of 1870, the money should be invested in the future of the Viennese population, and therefore in the purchase of the woods.
And that is exactly what happened in the 20th century.
We have not yet found the correct form. We are ready to work with Lower Austria to secure the recreational areas. Above all, we are striving to secure the western forests from Hamow to Breitenfeld for those seeking relaxation in Vienna, through spending many millions each year to purchase part of this area. The fact that we buy them creates the best protection for these areas. Because, whilst we could take other legislative measures, The authorities repeatedly find a way around them. And by that point, it's too late.
Aber es zeigt sich immer wieder, bis die Behörde draufkommt, steht meistens schon ein Haus dort. Und dann ist es zu spät.
This well-known German expression sums it up. Once the cake is cut, it will be gone very quickly. Even after the end of the monarchy, it is likely that the forest would have been sold piece by piece. There is always a need for regulation against the selfishness of individuals. That is why building regulations today factor in nature conservation, at least in theory. As Austria is still considered as the concreter of Central Europe, the Schöffels of our time will never tire of reminding us of this.
Well, Viennese people probably remember the Vienna woods. It's pretty sprawled out, I would say, so there are city planners like Otto Wagner who made plans and suggestions for expanding the city, even though it was already protected at the time. But for a large expanding city, it wouldn't have been out of the question for some people to include the Vienna woods in city plans. Due to land prices, there had been a bit of a decrease in expansion to the west, so you have to imagine that without this protection, Vienna would probably have grown a little differently, and perhaps there would be less towards the north and east and more towards the west and south. So these were suggestions that wouldn't have been so absurd at the time.
Otto Wagner, who achieved worldwide fame as a defining Art Nouveau architect at the turn of the century, was intensively involved and concerned with the further expansion of Vienna. In 1893, he emerged as the winner in a competition for the General Regulation Plan for Vienna. Wagner assumed that Vienna would expand significantly and grow to 4 million inhabitants. His vision was a metropolis with well-thought-out districts. But it hasn't quite come to this. Vienna is still characterized by its village origins in many parts of the city and has never become the cosmopolitan city that was designed on the drawing board. But the green belt in the west of Vienna has become an immensely valued living space, which is built upon as carefully as possible.
There is no way to enjoy the landscape without infrastructure, so we need paths, transport routes, accommodation, observation points, and so on in order to be able to enjoy our landscape. And that's how it was in our case, starting with the ice cream van and the first steel paths, which helped to bring people out of the city to the edge of the Vienna woods.
The Vienna woods finally found their final purpose at the end of the imperial era as a paradisical front garden of Vienna, a glamorous fairy tale city. As a summer destination, it experiences a heyday from Kahlenberg to Bad Vöslau, from Hietzing to Neulenbach, as people come to discover the forest. It was the birth of a place of longing that is still valued today. Popular places for early tourism in the Vienna woods were Pressbaum, Purkersdorf, Reckewinkel, and Pertholdsdorf. In the south, Gumpoldskirchen, Hinterbrühl, Baden, and Bad Vöslau refreshed their summer visitors. In the upper ends of demand were Grinzing, Sievering, and Neustift. The wealthy classes built summer villas here in the Vienna woods, but day trips to the guest houses could also be afforded by middle-class people. The noise and stench of the city caused by the building works are difficult to imagine today. In the summer, the wastewater meant that there were a lot of issues, so the best thing to do was to get out and enjoy free time in the country. That was everyone's main wish, from low-level bourgeoisie to the nobility. With the Sophienalpe, the Viennese even had an alpine pasture which could be reached. The mountain was named after Archduchess Sophie, the mother of Franz Joseph. who enjoyed spending her summers up there. The Western Railway and the Vienna Forest Railway opened small communities in green areas, perfect for escaping the big city and its unsanitary conditions. Moving the court was an incredible logistical challenge. Summer residences were often unfurnished, and all belongings were moved. There would be a designated furniture inspector to organize the transport. There were convoys of hundreds of carriages with packed furniture. All the dishes, laundry, paintings, and then the whole entourage traveled to the summer residences, so it was an incredible effort. Thorberg's Aunt Jolisch gave an insight into the city escapes that would last several weeks. At the end of June, everything would be packed, taking days to complete. Coffee service, salad cutlery, brooms, dusters. Everything had to be taken with them. The house staff were busy with packing, and the family had to eat in the restaurant. After a short trip, the vacationers would switch their outfits for airy clothes, enjoy a new forest backdrop, with the sound of hoofbeats and birdsong and the smell of manure mixed with flowers. Horse-drawn carriages picked up the guests and their lavish luggage from the train station. The wealthier the guest, the longer the stay. Nobles sent their staff ahead, moving into their summer homes once they had been prepared. Others rented a house for the whole season, and middle-class people stayed in inns and hotels. The Viennese travelled not only by railway, but also in the newly emerging automobiles. From the Vienna woods up into the hills, a dust-free road protecting the forest landscape was created. Because what would a country trip be without a beautiful view? The road was built in stages and completed in 1905, later expanded as a work program following issues of mass unemployment. Stretching 15 kilometers, the Hockenstrasse is still the longest road in Vienna today, reaching from Leopoldsburg to Neuwaldeck, a crucial route for day trippers. This is all thanks to one man's stubborn-headedness, who prevented the Habsburgs from making their sale. The former officer ultimately found his talent for politics.
The Vienna woods founded his political career without question, because after these experiences, he began to point out further issues all across the different parts of Austria, fighting against them. Because he had gained contacts in the press, he could use them to fight these other issues.
To better understand this personality and his actions, it is worth taking a look at his later career as mayor of Mödling. Although he made many contributions, he often offended the local council through undiscussed actions. He was a doer, an implementer, a calculator, and not a tactician, compromise maker, negotiator, or people pleaser. His head was as hard as his backbone.
He was very experienced, and of course, he was also extremely horrified by the state of the institutions, and later, as a politician, he gave up his officer's pension so that he could discuss and deal with the grievances in the army.
It took figures like him to ensure that Austria achieved freedom for the press and politically active citizens at the end of the monarchy.
Schöffel actually had a fight against capitalism, if you will, because nature, forests, and air are things which cannot be calculated and evaluated through capitalism. but rather they are things which have to be treated separately. Schöffel's process shows a lot. It shows how important freedom of the press is. It shows how important the environment is, and how privatization can affect these things. You can use it as a series of historical lessons to draw from.